Back, I'm not high into technology, so you should have a hard copy of a handout that just sort of goes through an outline of the different areas we discuss with you.
I passed
not
that
in a lot
out.
of detail.
Just
That we can always provide if you're
Right,
interested later, And just to let you know, I'm with the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, Greater Chicago. Most of you may know or may not know we're the big wastewater collection and treatment agency up in basically 98% of Cook County. We operate 7 treatment plants, all the way from 20 million gallons a day average dry weather flow design up to 850 million gallons a day average design flow. And our big plants discharge mainly into man-made channels that were built back in the 1800s to divert the pollution away from Lake Michigan, and they're mostly effluent-dominated waterways, accounting for maybe 90% of the flow within these waterways. Basically, the whole subject of the pharmaceuticals and other micro-constituents, one of our biggest problems is because of the analytical methodologies that are involved in the low concentrations. We're requiring very sophisticated methods and instrumentation that were not widely available. We ourselves, while we can measure certain organics, don't have the capability to do this analysis ourselves. So we have found that we have to collaborate with other agencies and with a number of university researchers on certain specific compounds of interest. Most of what I probably talk to is not so much on the pharmaceuticals, it's more on some of the other compounds of endocrine disruptors and bacterial sides that we've had focus our studies. As we go down through this thing, first we talk a little bit about some of the studies with regards to the wastewater treatment systems of the district. The big study that has been done in cooperation with US EPA and USGS and USDA has been a study at our Calumet water reclamation plant where we're actually sampling from the headworks, the influent through the different process streams into the effluent, including some of the solid processing handling. The bulk of the pharmaceuticals and those type of drugs have been done by the USGS, Larry Barber, his laboratory, and also their other lab. And I can't really report too much on their findings. He's given us some of the data is out. And basically a lot of the compounds he found are similar that they have found in other POTWs. But hopefully, and I got Todd here, that shortly they will be releasing that data and we'll have a better picture of what is happening through the treatment plant. The study actually involved 3 different sampling times in 3 different times of the year, of different years. And as I said, it was like 14 to 18 different points within the process system. Hopefully, once we see what those results are, we'll know what processes to maybe do a more concentrated study to look at the mechanisms of, because these compounds are removed under certain conditions as they pass through the plant, but not totally removed. There's always some traces left in the effluents. The next study that we talked about was one that was mainly interested in the alcohol phenols and epoxylates. And this was a combined study with Region 5 carried out over the 2003 to 2006, in which we sampled the influent and effluent from our various treatment plants. We sampled twice a year, once in the winter, once in the summer. Our labs did the influent analysis, and the EPA labs, because at that time our methodology wasn't sensitive enough, they did the effluent analyses. Just to give a quick overview for one of the plants, the larger plant, Stickney, and we find there again that these compounds are reduced as they go through the treatment process. On the average, the one influent for nonylphenol averaged roughly 50 micrograms per liter, and the effluent was 1.6. The NP1EO averaged around 40 micrograms per liter. The effluent was 3. and NP2EOs average about 7.8, and the effluent was 4.1. And this is based on, again, a limited number of samples, but they were spread out over a longer period of time, so we would hopefully catch some of the variability. Based on some of these findings, we looked at trying to look at industrial inputs to the system. So we looked at an area and our north side, because we thought there might be the more significant industries. But when we looked at certain industries based on their classification, some were food processors, or they just clean up of their work areas. Others were a couple of pharmaceutical formulation places, and we really didn't find anything. So then we concentrated on commercial laundries, and we did this at all of the laundries that are in our service area. And we found there, we did find the nanophenols and the epoxylates. And mainly, most of them were the epoxylates, which are used as surfacts in there. And we could account for approximately only varied from one plant to the other, roughly from less than 1% of the influent load to perhaps 9 or 10% of the influent load from the commercial laundry of a substantial source. But there are obviously other sources, and a lot of it is probably just through consumer products themselves. And we'll move down, and the next study that was done, and again looking at the alkophenols and the epoxylates, and this was part of the study that Beth has just finished on, and this was a study on the north side plant effluent, which is carried out over a 2-month period, one in the springtime, another 2-month period, September to October, and in the fall, in which samples were collected every other day. No, 3 times a week. 3 times a week, right? And they were, so we had a substantial number of samples. And as Beth has pointed out, the one striking thing is that during the colder weather, the effluent concentrations of these materials were higher than were observed in the warmer weather. And this is, does follow along with the findings of other studies that have been done. Hopefully we will be able to get into some type of study further into the actual treatment, again like with the pharmaceutical, into the actual treatment process itself, to try to look at the mechanisms and what type of operating conditions favor a better removal of these materials, and whether or not they're actually degraded. Then we move down to, we've also done studies on tricocarbon and triclosan, and for these studies we've contracted out with Dr. Halden out at Johns Hopkins. He recently has migrated over to Arizona State, but we hope to still be working with him. And again, which we sampled the influent and effluent and the digested sludge from those plants where we have digesters. And this again we've been carrying this out since 2005 through 2007. Again, taking samples, one in the summertime and samples in the wintertime. These are, again, I failed to mention composite samples rather than just a grab. And here again, for these compounds, we also note that there is a removal, from the influent of the plant to the effluent of the plant. Roughly, at the Stickney plant, we find averages of somewhere between 3 and 6 micrograms in the influent, and then in the effluent they're down to only a tenth to 0.3 of a microgram per liter. In the digested sludge, anaerobically digested sludge, there's a slightly higher concentration of the TCC versus the TCS, and they are roughly 15 milligrams per kilogram dry weight versus 10 milligrams per kilogram dry weight. And one would think that we should find higher of that, since that is the bigger percentage of the used in the commercial products, these germicidal soaps. From the wastewater plant, we have some studies that we're doing on our biosolids and in biosolids amended soils. Again, We again with Dr. Holden, and this was looking at levels not only just this would be anaerobically digested sludge that has been then dewatered through centrifugation, and it's that material that then has been applied to farmlands, both ones that we own ourselves down in Fulton County and some other farmlands where the farmers, we have some test plots. Excuse me. And again, similarly, as far as the levels in the cake go, they're roughly similar to what we found, maybe a little bit lower because maybe some of them got removed to the centrate. And again, we find more of the TCS the TCC than we did in the TCS. As far as then we going on and we did studies in terms of or a study where you're going to want to start out with Dr. O'Connor in the University of Florida. And this is actually to look at test plots where we're applying the biosolids in the soil and try to really look at what is happening to these compounds. Are they degrading? Are they moving through the soil? If they are degrading, can we determine the degradation rates? Some of the metabolites that may be formed from these compounds. Hopefully this study is just being initiated this coming year, this summer. And we'll see by the results next year what we will have. We looked again, looking at TCCs, and this is a long-term application that we have in Fulton County where we've been applying the biosolids to various farm plots since 1973. On these farm areas, they grow corn for feed, and now I think they're growing the corn for ethanol. But and unfortunately, it wasn't something where we've measured the actual amounts being applied. We know the amounts of biosolids, but we couldn't really say what are the amounts of the TCC and the TTCS. But we did want to figure it after all this time and the amount of material that's been applied to see what residual we have found in the soils. And the thing out of this one is that we found that most of the 90% of what we found in the top 4 feet of soil occurred in the top 12 inches, which would indicate a very low mobility of these compounds through the soil. To move on to another one, we do look at the polybrominated diphenyl ethers, flame retardants, and we've looked at that. This is through Dr. Lee in the University of Illinois at Chicago, and we did some sampling of, again, the centrifuge cake of anaerobically digested sludge, taking samples a couple of times a year. And here again, we find that, and we've done this for several years now, and we find that the concentrations that are collected in the early summer or in the summertime are tend to be slightly lower than the concentrations of samples that were collected in the wintertime. On the average, you're talking about 5 milligrams per kilogram versus 7 milligrams per kilogram. That there's a big variability in this sampling just in the sampling of the material itself. We also looked in these studies at these compounds we had what we call the short-term biosolids amended soils, and these were farm fields where we've been applying the biosolids for 3 years. The work was done. The analyses were done by Dr. Hale out of Virginia Institute of Marine Science, and he found it in the soil. But in this case, you're also looking at the corn that's being grown on these sites, and did not find any uptake so far in the corn stover. Similarly to what we did with the TCU, at the same time we were sampling the TCC and the TCS. We also sent out samples, and this was the Mississippi State for these particular group of samples, to look at PBDEs. And here again, it was similar to the TCC that we found 90% of the total amount of PCBs that were found occurred in the top 12 inches out of the 4-foot depth profile that was seen. Another area, and again this is with Dr. Zai at Mississippi State, again for PBDEs, and this was again looking at samples that were not applied at receiving biosolids, since 1973, and the non-monophenols, and again you follow the same pattern even for those. It's the top 12 inches compared to the 4-foot column. And again, remember, we did this here at Fulton County. There has not been any biosolids applied within the last 2 years now. So it isn't that this was newly applied material. It's whatever is accumulated over this span of time, almost now 35 years. If we go to some of the studies we've been involved with in our waterways involving aquatic life, the one was, as Beth has explained in more detail, the National North Shore Channel fish study, and I think she's covered that very well, so I'll just skip over that. We've started a study of our own, mainly looking at seeing whether or not we can develop. We're looking to try to measure the VTG in fish tissue by using one of these screening tests, and so we wanted to compare how our technique was, and can we use it to spot hot spots within the waterways. And so we collaborated with Dr. Winslow in the University of Florida. Besides measuring the vindicator, she's also doing the histological studies. And we just started this, and the preliminary results, yes, just like other people have found, you find an elevated concentration. You do find it occurring in the males that are in these streams that are below the treatment plant. However, so far, none of the fish tissue, or has been no evidence of any intersexual characteristics on these male carp. And we're sampling carp because we've got a lot more carp than we have bass. We don't want to deplete the bass from the waterways by taking them for science. The other one we're doing is now that they've set a water quality standard of 6.6 micrograms per liter for nonylphenol, we've initiated a sampling at a number, we've got about 26, I think, locations in our waterways that we sample on a monthly basis to be looking at water quality criteria, etc. And we started this about a little over a year ago, and we sampled once a month. And so far, we have found no levels that even approach the 6.6 water quality standard that has been set. Our detection limit is roughly 1.3, although our lab likes to say the reporting limit is 5 micrograms per liter. I think I skipped I did skip one, and she's going to be mad at me. We have done, to back up, we have done an antibiotic resistant bacteria study through our wastewater treatment process. Yeah, that was at the bottom of the first page. Mainly because there's questions being floated around. We're developing these antibiotic resistant bacteria, and are they multiplying within the wastewater treatment process? And basically looked at several of the more common antibiotics and measuring against controls and the plate test. I'm not the microbiologist, so I can't give you all the details. But the basic thing was, no, that we did not see, in fact, we saw it, just like with all the other bacteria in general, we saw a decrease in the numbers from the influent to the effluent of the plant. And hopefully, and this is one that hopefully we intend to repeat this, they want to do a study repeating it within our waterways above and below the treatment plants to see whether or not do we find and what type and do we find a problem with these antibiotic resistant bacteria. I got a list of some of the reports that we have available. They're on our website, and there is the paper has been published on the bacteria study, both in the journal, and it's also a report that's available on our website. I neglected to put it on here. I did not show you, the website is mwrd.org, and if there's anybody has specific questions or if there's some data that we can make available, my email address is david.lordi@mwrd.org. And because as you can see from this, we are very amenable to collaborating with the other researchers who have the abilities and capabilities we don't have. And in fact, we are always searching out other people we can do this work because we're interested in trying to delve into into many of the questions that are raised about these compounds. And that ends my